So when we were discussing the concept of risk management, we highlighted that one of the techniques or one of the steps in risk management is to perform risk assessment. Risk assessment is a process within the overall risk management. Risk assessment is about risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. And in order to identify the risk, we mentioned before that we need to have a clear or a complete inventory for our data or for our assets. And based on this inventory, we can start in identifying the risks that could be associated with such assets or such data. So one of the techniques to perform this identification is the threat modeling. So threat modeling is a structured approach to identify potential threats and vulnerabilities to either system, application, or organization process. And the threat modeling is an ongoing process because we have changes or we have dynamic in the context of the threat landscape. So threat modeling can be used in order to build the cybersecurity controls by identifying what could be the issues, what could be the threats, what could be the emerging threats, and based on that, we can identify the required controls for such security threats to counter these threats. So threat modeling steps generally start by identifying the assets, creating a threat model, and the threat model is a kind of conceptual representation of the system application being analyzed, including the components, the processes, data flows, and we start in identifying what could be the possible threats for each one of these components. For example, if my application, which is under the threat modeling right now, is being assessed against the data tampering, so we will explain that in our application, we have a process of data transmission between system A and system B. So we will identify the communication between these two systems as a candidate for cyber attack or cyber threat that can lead to data tampering. So how data tampering could occur? By sniffing the traffic or intercepting the traffic. Here we identify the threat. How we can protect? By making sure we have encryption on for data being transmitted for system A to system B, and also by making sure that there is a strong authentication configured between these two systems, and this strong authentication might rely on digital signature or private certificate, so we can assure that no other body can intercept the communication between these two individuals. That's what do we mean by creating a threat model. We are basically decompile the structure of our application or our process and try to figure out what could be the adverse scenarios that could lead in impacting or subjecting the confidentiality or integrity or the availability for this application to a problem. After identifying the problems or identifying the risks and threats, we assess these risks from the context of likelihood and impact, and then we do a prioritization for security measures. Like, what do we need to apply as a security controls? What is the most severe and critical risk of all of these identified risks? Then what kind of security control that we need to apply. So as you can see, there is a kind of intersection here between threat modeling and between risk assessment. But basically, we can say that threat modeling is only about identifying threats by doing like a conceptual architecture for the application and start in analyzing what could be the cyber threats that could impact or could attack each flow or each aspect or each component from the application components. And then we move to the risk analysis, which is about assessing the risk. And then we go to risk evaluation, if you can remember. And based on risk evaluation, we will identify if risk is within appetite or not. And then we will decide what kind of security controls that we need to apply. However, threat modeling is not just a process that is used in the context of risk management. When I decide or when I have a task for developing a new application or to establish the security requirements in a newly developed system or a system that is under development, we usually do a brainstorming sessions, and during these brainstorming sessions we ask people who are responsible for designing the internal components of the application to give us information about data flow diagram of the application, sequence diagram of the application, the internal components of the application, the features that are going to be delivered by this application, and we start doing threat modeling on it. So we use we use a lot of techniques that can help us in performing the threat modeling. So for example, here I'm providing you an example for a practical threat model for creating a new web-based e-commerce system. So we need to identify the assets, which will be our web application and the back end of this application, the domain name service of this application, and the domain management of this application. We will also identify the data that will be protected by the application. If we have a mobile application that will be used as a front end for allowing customers to access this web-based application through a mobile phone, we need to evaluate the components of this mobile application, including what will be the authentication mechanism. Is it biometric authentication? Where the credentials or user cookies will be stored? Will it be stored in a secure storage on this mobile application? All of these aspects will be used, and based on that, we will start creating our threat model. And in that case, we will start in, let's say, defining what is the components of our application. Like we have our users, we have web server, we have login process inside, we have a library database, and we have web pages that are loaded. And here we have SQL communication. We are defining what is the components of this application, and we basically start and identifying what is the processes. So user is doing login, web server is doing authentication with the login process is authenticating with SQL or querying SQL database in order to validate if the provided user password or provided hash is similar for what is stored. And after then we start in identifying the threats by creating a threat tree. And in identification of threats, we start in providing what could be the possible examples for threats. Like, for example, for password attack or for user login, hacker might perform brute force authentication, which means that he will use fuzzing or he will use a technique for trying millions of passwords. So in that case, as a security specialist, we will assess the risk of such activity, such as a brute force, and we will decide, yes, this is very risky threat and it could happen. So we need to apply like login limitation or password maximum login limitations. So if someone managed or if someone tried the password more than once, in that case, the password or the account will be logged, or the IP address which is performing this authentication activity will be blocked. So using threat tree, we can identify the risk, and then we can start in prioritizing the security measures and perform a reduction analysis, which is about evaluating the control, evaluate its effectiveness, and prioritize the implementation of it. So threat modeling is not just an important process in risk management, but also even if you are required to introduce security requirements in a new application or in a new system or in a new process, you might need to perform the threat modeling. So in threat modeling, we have a couple of techniques that we are going to identify, and these techniques could be useful and provide a structured approach that can help you in performing the threat model in a practical manner from the context of IT. But of course, if I'm trying to evaluate the threats for another, let's say, activity other than IT system, I might have another other techniques that can be used and can be beneficial in that case.